Mortimer Adler's The Great Conversation ensures us that even though we may find reading classics difficult, we will eventually fall in love with them as our skill grows. The Nichomachean Ethics was that book for me. I enjoyed the other works that we've studied so far, but this particular work I absolutely devoured. I've been really excited to dig into Aristotle. Its importance is such that it occupies 2 whole volumes of this set. Aristotle is the foundation of so much of what is yet to come. Aristotle's Nichomachean Ethics, in a running theme of this series, contains a vast treasure trove of useful and interesting ideas. It is a clear development of many of the themes of Plato's Republic, while focusing more on the individual than the state. I can't do justice to everything in this book, and so that leaves me only to implore you to read it for yourself. Throughout this series, I've often wrestled with how to approach discussing each work, and while reading, I realised a key distinction in the various approaches. The 10-year reading plan that we're following together has been front-loaded with a great deal of philosophy, and so I have been approaching the project as a philosophical study. But this actually isn't the case overall. There is a huge range of literature ahead of us. And while I love philosophy, this project isn't a study of philosophy. And I know that this is a sort of meta-commentary on the whole project, but it really helped me decide why I was reading all of this. I can choose the appropriate level of detail and just read with an open mind, learn what I can, and not worry about understanding every metaphysical construct or argument. My name is Harry Smith, and this is Pages to Practice, where we discuss the world's greatest books and how we can use them. Today, we're going to be figuring out what exactly virtue ethics are, how do we decide on a virtuous path, and how can we bring about human flourishing. The Nichomachean Ethics is an important work in philosophy because it is the first presentation of a complete moral theory as a thing worthy of study in of itself. Aristotle actually wrote 2 ethical treatises. This one, the Nichomachean Ethics, and the Eudemian Ethics. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. The texts share a lot in common with each other, and the Eudemian Ethics is considered a revision of the Nichomachean Ethics. This is just the more widely read work, the Nichomachean Ethics, and from now on out I shall just simply refer to it as the Ethics. Aristotle introduces a theory of living that we now refer to as virtue ethics. That is, that the best possible life is brought about by understanding the best possible virtues and embodying them. This is distinct from other moral theories that may try to prescribe a systematic way of action. Aristotle thought that the study of ethics could not be so precise. And though it's possible to list out many easy statements, murder is wrong, theft is wrong, there is far too much complexity in the human experience for this to be complete. And so, our ethical theory, we must suffice with generality. I think that this approach is wise. Proper limit to the inquiry makes it useful in the real world. There has been a temptation by thinkers to construct a logical position that encapsulates all possibilities in domains that resist such rigid classification. How to live and what is right or wrong is certainly one of those domains. Where the exceptions are a vast quantity larger than the generalities, it will be impossible to say anything more than guiding principles. The hope is that these guiding principles will let good people make the right decision when the time comes. Aristotle further limits the inquiry to just those that have already had a good upbringing. Aristotle takes it for granted that you already agree that these virtues are worthy of pursuit, and you have some familiarity with them. This may just be a practical decision to move on with the primary task of exploring these virtues without having first to justify them. Later in the text, Aristotle draws distinction between those that have or do not have the faculty of reason. The so-called brutish man is incapable of acting different to his nature, and is of a lesser evil than those of us who use reason to do evil things. Virtue depends on reason, and so we can only discuss virtue in the context of those that have had reason instilled within them since childhood, an echoing of a similar educational ideal as we talked about in Plato's Republic. In the translation of the Ethics included in the great books of the Western world, the word happiness is used a lot. However, the underlying Greek word eudaimonia is also translated sometimes as flourishing. And I think that flourishing better captures what Aristotle was aiming for. The problem with what the pursuit of happiness implies is that we are much tempted by the bodily pleasures. Sometimes the right thing to do is to do something unpleasant. We can't feast on cookies and watch TikTok all day. Flourishing implies that we should do what is best overall in generating the best possible life, not just what makes us happy right now. Zooming out to this more holistic view of what you're trying to achieve is vastly more useful. Aristotle argues that we alone on earth have the faculty of reason, and because this is what differentiates us from the lower animals, it must be what makes us humans. And so it is our proper task to use our reasoning faculty to live well. Immediately, we see that a life that is slavish to passion and impression is not one that exploits the proper use of reason. This idea of right reasoning is a principle that continues the idea of the tripart soul that was introduced in the Republic. We need reason because virtue lies at the mean of two extremes. And it's not at all easy for us to decide what this mean is. For example, courage is the mean between cowardice and recklessness. Temperance is the mean between self-indulgence and unnecessary asceticism. If you try this for yourself, you'll notice something that Aristotle noticed, which is that we don't have names for many of the intermediates between the extremes or for the extremes themselves. That's one of the challenges of puzzling them out. It's also the case that the words are often used in comparison to one another. Consider the word ambition. We describe people as both too ambitious and not ambitious enough, depending on whether we are currently considering ambition to be worthy or unworthy. The core of this golden mean is that we can either have an excess of some trait or a deficiency of some trait. This implies that most activities have some use and most passions could be harnessed to a useful end. It's the application of reason that tells us when this is the case. A few months ago, it occurred to me that diet, for example, is usually presented as a problem of systems and actions, but it's actually a philosophical problem. If you don't deal with the idea that giving into temptation is okay, then you'll never get anything more than a temporary reprieve from it. There is not one absolute golden mean between virtues for all people. It's relative to each and every person to puzzle out for themselves. This is one of the reasons why we can't be prescriptive about virtue ethic. What is courageous for the soldier in battle is reckless for the father at home. We all have our natures and are suited to different tasks. Aristotle believed this, which we'll also explore in his Politics, and so did Plato in his Republic. The extremes of the mean are different for each person, so the mean itself has to be different. I want to really focus on this idea of intermediates between extremes as a way of finding virtue, because one, it's the major idea of the text, but B, I think it's the most practical idea for day-to-day use. Aristotle has a startling insight about the nature of these extremes that once you realise, you'll immediately find value in its practical application. The extremes of either side of the mean aren't necessarily equidistant. Consider the consumption of food, where people are much more likely to indulge than they are to not eat enough. Or material things, where again, we're more likely to accumulate too much than to have not enough. There are certain base behaviours that we are more likely to fall prey to, at the general and the individual level. Recognising this, Aristotle prescribes a routine of overcorrection to bring yourself back to the mean. The thinking is that you are probably worse than you think. So by overcompensating, you'll land exactly where you want to be. Be cautious about bodily pleasure. Be more generous than you think is wise. Err on the side of too calm and accepting rather than not enough. Because it's so likely that you'll fall prey to these opposites, your overcorrection won't go nearly as far as you think. Aristotle believed that in some basic way, we will do whatever we find pleasurable. If we find acting with virtue pleasurable, then we will. And if we find otherwise, then we'll do that instead. So if we want people to live well, they must be educated to live well. It seems to me that the implicit assumption is that we find pleasure in what is wrong a more natural state than finding pleasure in what is right. And so we have to take action against that. Aristotle frames this as a habit, the habit being much easier to instill in the young rather than the old. What we do out of habit becomes skillful, and what we do skillfully becomes pleasurable. There are a couple of very key takeaways here. The first, I think, is that we should take extreme care in the thoughts we entertain and the language that we use. British people, in particular, complain, moan, and are pessimistic to the nth degree. I am at times no exception. People are even strangely proud of it, which strikes me as odd. We build this strange habit, then it totally infects our worldview. The idea that being skillful is pleasurable is an approach that can inform everything from what we do with our life, as argued by Robert Greene in Mastery, to how we should approach every task. In particular, a common problem I face with younger staff is their unwillingness to do what they consider unworthy tasks. They want more money, more respect, and to do the more supposedly exciting work. The tasks given aren't deliberately poor to haze them. In fact, they aren't poor at all. It's a matter of perception. How they approach the given task is very indicative of their attitude. We all will work jobs and go through times and have tasks that we'd rather not be doing. If you approach it with the attitude of doing it to the best of your ability, it will be pleasurable. And you'll stand out because of that. The hardest part of the text comes in Book 6, when having completed a thorough examination of ethical virtue, Aristotle turns to what he calls the intellectual virtues. His motivation for doing so is to discover what it is that allows us to determine the mean between two extremes. It's confusing because it sets out to answer this question, but doesn't come to much of a conclusion. At times, it seems to place practical wisdom at the top of the hierarchy, and at other times, theoretical wisdom. The 5 intellectual virtues are theoretical wisdom, science, intuitive understanding, practical wisdom, and craft expertise. Each virtue takes up a different epistemological task, and it's theoretical and practical wisdom that is of the most interest to ethics. I can't claim to understand this passage particularly well, but the respective section on Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's page is worth reading. There is this idea that practical wisdom is the actions of a just man. Happiness, or flourishing, is not something that is arrived at as a state of mind, but the actual actions that one takes. If you want happiness, do something about it. Practical wisdom deals in the particulars of a case, not over-applying generalities when they don't apply. For Aristotle, the idea that you would look at the particulars rather than overgeneralizing was the definition of being just. It appears that Aristotle has a bone to pick with busybodies, bureaucracies, and tyrants all. I can't help but agree. The over-adherence to an imperfect set of rules is a debilitating fault. In the final book, Aristotle turns to the question of the pursuit of philosophy, and that of a contemplative life. He compares three types of life: the life of pleasure, the life of politics, and the life of knowledge and understanding, or philosophy. His conclusion is prominently in the camp of the philosopher. No surprises there. The construction of virtue ethics is in service for this ideal, that a philosopher can't really do philosophy if they are not virtuous. Because a philosopher seeks the ultimate truth, which is the ultimate good, then he must be virtuous, because virtue forms a part of this ultimate good as a whole. Politics is considered to be better than a life of pleasure, but not as good as the human flourishing brought about in pure contemplation. Aristotle does at least concede that if we want to bring about the best possible life for all, then legislation is necessary to guide people to virtue. And I'm sure that our next work, Aristotle's Politics, will teach us all about this particular philosophical conception of what the law is for. The principal objection to the Nichomachean Ethics may be that it doesn't really give us a framework for deciding anything. And yet, maybe we should view this as a fault in ourselves. In essence, Aristotle is imploring us to deeply consider what we take virtue to be and what its principles are, so that we can come to our own ethical framework for virtue. It's this hard work that we often try to avoid, and I think I would praise Aristotle for not falling for that temptation. Nowadays, the most widely read books are the ones that do this thinking for you, and that's a real shame. There are many ideas we didn't touch on from the Nichomachean Ethics, two major ones being Aristotle's theory of friendship and continence as something between vice and virtue. Even in the topics we did cover, there's a great more detail in the text. Any one person's interpretation of a great book can only be a small subset of the work as a whole. And maybe one day I'll read it again and I'll find entirely different passages, the ones that stand out to me. If you want the full picture, there will never be a substitute for reading it, and all the links to this work and others mentioned are in the description box below. If you've never read a primary text before and you'd like to read one alongside me, I'm currently running a read-along of Epictetus's Discourses, and the link to my Substack is in the description box, so if you want to follow that, subscribe there. If you've read the Nichomachean Ethics, I'd love to know what you thought about it. Let me know in the comments below. For now, my name is Harry Smith, and this is Pages to Practice.